The Galactic Military Academy floated in the void between three star systems, its massive structure gleaming like a silver jewel against the cosmic darkness. For over 2,000 years, it had trained the finest military minds from across the known galaxy. Representatives from hundreds of species walked its corridors, learning the ancient arts of strategy, tactics, and warfare. Commander Zektar adjusted his ceremonial armor as he prepared for another routine briefing. The Velthari officer had seen countless new classes arrive over his decades of service, each bringing their own unique perspectives to military doctrine. Some species excelled at long-term planning, others at rapid deployment, and a few at technological innovation. Yet despite this diversity, one challenge had remained unsolved for exactly 103 standard years. The Siege of Korvac Prime. It wasn't a real siege, of course. The actual battle had ended centuries ago when the Korvaki defenders had finally surrendered after a brutal 18-month blockade. But the Academy had recreated it as the ultimate training scenario, a perfect storm of tactical complexity that combined space combat, planetary assault, resource management, and diplomatic maneuvering all into one nightmarish puzzle. The scenario was legendary among military circles. Every species had attempted it. The brilliant Zephyrian hive minds with their perfect coordination had failed. The ancient crystalline collective with their millennia of experience had failed. Even the warlike Kreks, who lived and breathed combat doctrine, had failed spectacularly. The best anyone had ever achieved was reducing the siege time from the historical 18 months to 14 months and 12 days. That record belonged to a joint Altarian Nexus team that had graduated 47 years ago and were now considered among the finest strategic minds in the galaxy. Zektar entered the main briefing hall, where today's new arrivals waited in neat rows according to their species groupings. He recognized most of the delegations immediately. The towering Gorathi with their forearms and tactical implants, the ethereal Luminari whose translucent bodies seemed to shimmer with internal light, the insectoid Chitrix clicking their mandibles in what passed for polite conversation. But in the back corner sat a group he'd never seen before. They were remarkably unremarkable. Bipedal, roughly humanoid, with pale skin and strange patches of fur only on their heads. Their uniforms bore a symbol he didn't recognize, and they sat with a casual confidence that seemed almost insulting in the presence of so many established galactic powers. Attention. Cadets, Zektar's voice boomed across the hall, translated instantly into dozens of languages by the Academy's systems. Welcome to your final year at the Galactic Military Academy. You have all excelled in your individual studies, mastered the basics of interstellar warfare, and proven yourselves capable officers. But now comes your greatest test. He gestured, and a massive holographic display materialized above the assembled cadets. It showed a detailed star system with a heavily fortified world at its center, surrounded by defensive platforms, minefields, and patrol routes. The Siege of Korvac Prime, Zektar continued. For over a century, this scenario has challenged the finest military minds our galaxy has produced. The rules are simple. Break the siege and capture the planet with minimal casualties and resources. You have access to a standard galactic fleet consisting of 200 ships of various classes, 50,000 troops, and a support network spanning 3 systems. Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. Every cadet had heard stories of this legendary challenge. Many had spent years preparing theoretical approaches, knowing they would eventually face this ultimate test. The historical record stands at 18 months, Zektar announced. The Academy record is 14 months and 12 days. Most attempts fail entirely, resulting in either unacceptable casualties or complete strategic defeat. You will be divided into teams of 12, representing multinational cooperation as befits future galactic officers. As Zektar read out the team assignments, he noticed something odd about the unknown species in the back. While other cadets frantically took notes or whispered strategic discussions, these newcomers simply listened with calm attention. One of them, a female with brown head fur and surprisingly bright eyes, actually seemed to be fighting back what looked like amusement. Team Designation Omega, Zektar read from his list. Cadets representing the recently contacted Sol system. Designation Human. You will be assigned Standard Academy mentors to assist with galactic military protocol. The humans, that was their species name, stood and offered what appeared to be a respectful nod. Their apparent leader, A tall male with short-cropped hair and calculating eyes stepped forward. "Commander, with respect," the human said in accented but clear galactic standard. "We appreciate the offer of mentors, but we'd prefer to attempt the scenario on our own first. Learn by doing, as we say." Sektar's crest flared in surprise. In his decades of service, no first-year team had ever requested to tackle the Korvax scenario without experienced guidance. "It was tactical suicide, Cadet," Sektar prompted. "Miller, sir. Cadet Commander James Miller, representing the United Earth Defense Force." "Cadet Miller, I must advise against this course of action. The Korvax scenario has defeated teams with centuries of combined military experience. Perhaps you should observe a few attempts first, learn the conventional approaches." "Commander," another human interrupted, the female with the bright eyes. "No disrespect intended, but we've studied your conventional approaches in our pre-arrival briefings. We think we might have a different perspective to offer." The hall had gone completely silent. Every eye sensor and optical organ focused on this unprecedented display of confidence from completely unknown aliens. Some of the more established species began making sounds that, while species-specific, universally translated to skeptical amusement. Sektar found himself in an unusual position. Academy protocol allowed cadets to attempt scenarios without supervision, but it also required him to prevent obvious disasters. These humans seemed sincere but clearly had no idea what they were facing. "Very well," he decided. "Team Omega, you are scheduled for the Korvax scenario tomorrow at 800 Standard Time. I will personally observe to ensure safety protocols are maintained." He paused, studying their confident faces. "I hope you understand that failure in this scenario doesn't merely mean graduation delays. Poor performance can result in complete dismissal from the Academy program." Cadet Miller smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both respectful and predatory. "Understood, Commander. We'll do our best not to disappoint." As the briefing dispersed and teams began discussing strategy, Sektar lingered to watch the humans. Instead of huddling around tactical displays or requesting access to historical battle records like every other team, they simply talked amongst themselves in quiet, confident tones. One of them, a stocky male with scarred hands, actually laughed at something his teammate said. For the first time in decades, Sektar found himself genuinely curious about how a scenario would unfold. These humans either possessed insights that had escaped every military mind in the galaxy for over a century, or they were about to provide the most spectacular failure in Academy history. Either way, tomorrow promised to be interesting. The Academy's massive library complex hummed with activity as evening settled over the station. Teams from dozens of species occupied private study chambers, their holographic displays showing fleet movements, supply calculations, and tactical projections. The atmosphere was thick with concentration and barely contained anxiety. In Chamber 47, Team Designation Omega spread out around a circular table as the Korvax Prime scenario materialized in full detail above them. The 12 humans studied the display with expressions ranging from thoughtful analysis to what could only be described as professional interest. "Okay," said Cadet Miller, leaning back in his chair with surprising casualness. "So let me get this straight. We've got a heavily fortified world with multiple layers of orbital defenses, asteroid mining operations providing raw materials, and a population of roughly 2 billion Korvaki, who are apparently willing to fight to the last citizen." Cadet Sarah Chen, the woman who had spoken up during the briefing, manipulated the display to zoom in on the defensive platforms. "The energy shields covering the planet can withstand sustained bombardment from our entire fleet for approximately 6 months, according to the Academy's calculations. The orbital fortresses are positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and they've got enough supplies to last 2 years minimum. Don't forget the fun part," added Cadet Rodriguez, a compact man with pilot's insignia on his uniform. "Any attempt to land troops gets met with surface-to-orbit missiles that can punch through our transport shields like they're made of paper. And if we try a siege, the Korvaki have enough agricultural stations to remain self-sufficient indefinitely." The team continued their analysis with the methodical efficiency of professionals, but without the desperate urgency that characterized the other study chambers. Outside their room, they could hear the Zephyrian hive mind generating dozens of overlapping strategic discussions simultaneously, while the Krex team next door was arguing loudly about optimal attack vectors. You know what's interesting? Said Cadet Thompson, a tall woman with the bearing of an engineer. Every historical attempt has focused on the same basic approaches. Either they try to overwhelm the defenses with brute force, which fails because the shields are too strong, or they attempt elaborate flanking maneuvers that take months to coordinate and ultimately fail because the Korvaki have too much time to adapt. It's almost like everyone's trying to fight the same war, observed Cadet Park, a slight Asian man whose academy records listed him as a communications specialist. They see a siege, so they think they need to break a siege. Classic tactical tunnel vision. Miller nodded, then gestured to expand the display to show the entire star system. What's the actual objective here? I mean the real objective, not just capture the planet. Chen consulted her datapad. According to the scenario briefing, Korvac Prime has strategic value due to its position controlling 3 major trade routes and its substantial manufacturing capabilities. The Korvaki government has declared independence from the Galactic Federation and is threatening to disrupt interstellar commerce. So we need to neutralize the threat and restore legitimate governance. Rodriguez mused. Doesn't necessarily require invasion. Except the Korvaki leadership has retreated to underground bunkers specifically designed to survive orbital bombardment, added Thompson. And the civilian population supports them, so we can't just glass the planet without committing genocide. Their discussion was interrupted by a soft chime indicating someone was requesting entry. Miller authorized access, and the door slid open to reveal 3 cadets from Team Alpha, the Garathi delegation that had won several recent strategy competitions. The leader, a massive 4-armed warrior named Kethvar, stepped forward with what passed for diplomatic courtesy among his species. Humans, he rumbled in heavily accented standard. We come offering alliance. Alliance? Miller raised an eyebrow. For what? Tomorrow's scenario, Kethvar explained. Garathi tactical doctrine emphasizes strength through cooperation. We propose joint approach, our strategic experience combined with your enthusiasm. The pause before enthusiasm carried a weight of polite skepticism that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Behind Kethavar, his teammates made subtle gestures that in Garathi culture indicated protective concern, the sort usually reserved for children about to make dangerous mistakes. Chen exchanged glances with Miller before responding. We appreciate the offer, Kethvar, but Academy rules specify team composition for the scenario. Besides, we're curious to see how our approach works out. Your approach? The second Garathi, whose translator identified him as Sub-Commander Velthak, leaned forward with genuine interest. What strategic doctrine does human military tradition follow? We studied your species' preliminary files, but found only references to asymmetrical warfare and adaptive tactics. These terms lack precision. Park grinned, an expression that seemed to make the Garathi slightly uncomfortable. That's because precision isn't really the point. We tend to make things up as we go along. Make things up? Kethavar's vocal harmonics shifted to frequencies that suggested confusion bordering on alarm. But tactical planning requires months of preparation, detailed logistics coordination, and careful analysis of enemy capabilities. How can you make things up in military operations? Well, Rodriguez said, pulling up a new display showing historical human conflicts. There was this one time during our Second World War when we convinced the enemy that we were going to invade at one location by creating an entire fake army, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. Then we attacked somewhere completely different. Or the time we ended a siege by tunneling under the walls and setting off explosives, added Thompson. Or when we won a naval battle by ramming our ships into the enemy fleet while they were on fire. The Garathi exchanged what could only be described as worried looks. Velthak's translator struggled with the concept for a moment before producing, You set your own ships on fire? Deliberately? Only when it worked better than not setting them on fire, Chen said helpfully. Kethvar's crest began to flatten against his skull, a sign of deep concern among his species. Perhaps our alliance offer was premature. Garathi doctrine requires predictable outcomes based on tested strategies. Your methods appear to rely on... He paused, searching for the right words. Controlled chaos. Uncontrolled chaos, actually, Miller corrected with a slight smile. Controlled chaos implies we know what we're doing ahead of time. After the Garathi delegation left, Moving considerably faster than they had arrived, the human team returned to their analysis. But word of their conversation had apparently spread, because over the next 2 hours they received visits from 6 other teams. The Crystalline Collective offered to share their mathematical modeling systems. The Altarians wanted to discuss historical precedents. Even the notoriously isolationist void swimmers emerged from their environmental suits to inquire about human chaos tactics. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. The visiting aliens would offer assistance or advice, the humans would explain their general approach, and the visitors would leave looking increasingly concerned about tomorrow's scenario, though not necessarily for the reasons they'd initially expected. You know, Chen observed as the last delegation departed, I'm starting to think the other species might be overthinking this whole scenario. Overthinking? Rodriguez laughed. Sarah, they've been working on this problem for a century. We've been looking at it for about 6 hours. By any reasonable standard, we're underthinking it by several orders of magnitude. Maybe, Thompson said, manipulating the display to show supply route calculations. But look at this. Every failed attempt in the Academy records follows basically the same pattern. They identify the key defensive systems, calculate the forces needed to overcome them, develop detailed operational timelines, and then execute methodical campaigns that take months to complete. Park nodded. It's like they're all trying to solve the same equation, just with different variables. But what if the equation itself is wrong? Miller stood and walked around the holographic display, studying it from different angles. The Korvaki are expecting a siege. They've prepared for a siege. Their entire defensive strategy is built around surviving a siege. So what happens if we don't give them a siege? Elaborate, Chen prompted. Every species here thinks like generals because they're trained to think like generals. They see a military problem and apply military solutions. But what if this isn't really a military problem? The room fell quiet as 12 human minds began working through the implications. Outside, they could hear the continued discussions from other teams. Detailed analyses of orbital mechanics, supply calculations accurate to the nearest decimal point, and contingency planning that covered hundreds of potential scenarios. You're right, Thompson said slowly. We're not actually trying to conquer Korvac Prime. We're trying to resolve a political crisis that happens to have military components. And the beautiful thing about political crises, Rodriguez added with growing excitement, is that they usually have non-military solutions that nobody thinks to look for. Chen began pulling up new displays, not tactical projections, but economic data, communication network. The Academy's main simulation chamber was a marvel of galactic engineering. Spanning nearly 1 kilometer in diameter, it could recreate any environment from the vacuum of space to the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres. This morning it hummed with the power of thousands of quantum processors generating the most complex military scenario in known galactic history. Commander Zektar arrived early, coffee steaming in his hands, a recently acquired habit learned from the Academy's exchange program with a minor species called Terrans. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing the Academy's files on humanity, what little existed. The reports were confusing, filled with contradictions and statistical anomalies that made no sense when compared to other species' profiles. According to the data, humans had developed spaceflight relatively recently but had somehow produced a military doctrine that their own instructors described as adaptively aggressive and strategically unpredictable. They had won conflicts against superior forces through methods that violated conventional tactical wisdom so consistently that their victories appeared to be statistical impossibilities. Commander, came a familiar voice. Senior Instructor Velnara approached, her Altarian features showing the subtle biorhythmic patterns that indicated professional concern. I trust you reviewed the overnight developments? Zektar's crest flattened slightly. Developments? Team Omega submitted their preliminary resource requests at Oro 300 this morning. Velnara handed him a datapad. The list is unusual. Zektar reviewed the document, his confusion growing with each line item. Standard fleet allocations, normal enough, assault troops expected, but then came entries that made no sense. Commercial broadcasting equipment, entertainment database access, civilian clothing and personal items, and most puzzling of all, kitchen facilities and food preparation supplies. Did they submit this as a joke? Zektar asked, Instructor Markek asked the same question. Cadet Miller insisted all items were mission-critical and requested priority processing. Vilnara's patterns shifted to deeper concern. Commander, perhaps we should delay this scenario. These humans appear to be treating a military exercise as some sort of recreational activity. Before Zektar could respond, the chamber doors opened and Team Omega entered. The 12 humans walked with casual confidence. Their uniforms crisp, but their demeanor relaxed in a way that seemed almost inappropriate given the magnitude of what they were attempting. Following them came what appeared to be half the Academy's cadet population. Word had spread through the dormitories overnight about the unknown species that claimed they could solve the Korvax scenario without mentors, and students from dozens of worlds had arrived to witness what promised to be either a spectacular breakthrough or an equally spectacular failure. Cadets, Zektar addressed the human team as they approached the central command platform. Are you prepared for the scenario? Miller nodded, then gestured to his teammates who were already taking their positions at various control stations. Ready when you are, Commander. Although we do have one small request, which is, we'd prefer if the observers could see our communications and strategic discussions in real time. Transparency builds trust, and we want everyone to understand our approach. Zektar exchanged glances with his fellow instructors. It was highly unusual, but not against regulations. Very well. All communication channels will be recorded and broadcast to the observation deck. The simulation began with the familiar orchestral tones that had introduced the Korvax scenario for over a century. The chamber's walls dissolved into the depths of space, revealing the target system in perfect detail. Korvax Prime hung like a blue-green jewel at the center, surrounded by the familiar constellation of defense platforms, patrol ships, and orbital installations that had defeated every previous attempt. The human fleet materialized at the system's edge. 200 ships arranged in standard formation. On the observation deck, alien cadets leaned forward in anticipation. Everyone knew how this would begin. Detailed scans of enemy positions, careful analysis of defensive capabilities, and methodical planning for a campaign measured in months. Instead, Cadet Park opened a communication channel to the entire Korvaki system on all frequencies. Attention citizens of Korvax Prime, his voice carried clearly through the chamber's speakers. This is the United Earth Defense Force representing the Sol system's recent membership in the Galactic Federation. We're here to resolve the current political situation through peaceful dialogue and mutual cooperation. A collective intake of breath echoed through the observation deck. In over a century of attempts, no team had ever opened communications with anything other than military surrender demands. On the planet below, the Korvaki leadership's response crackled back immediately. Unknown vessels, withdraw immediately or face the consequences. We do not recognize the Federation's authority, and we will defend our independence with our lives. Park's response was prompt and cheerful. Understood. We respect your desire for independence and have no intention of forcing unwanted governance upon you. However, we're hoping we might discuss some alternative arrangements that could benefit everyone involved. Zektar found himself leaning forward, despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. This was unlike any military scenario he'd ever witnessed. The humans weren't presenting ultimatums or making threats. They were talking as if they were conducting trade negotiations rather than military operations. What alternative arrangements? The Korvaki response came after a delay that suggested frantic consultation with their leadership. Chen stepped forward to take the communications role. Well, we understand your primary concerns involve autonomy and economic self-determination. The Federation's main interest is maintaining stable trade routes and preventing disruption to interstellar commerce. It seems like there might be room for compromise. Rodriguez, manning the tactical station, began deploying the fleet in a pattern that initially looked like standard siege positioning. But instead of establishing blockade formations, the ship spread out to create what appeared to be a protective perimeter around the entire system. What we're proposing, Chen continued, is a modified independence arrangement. Korvax Prime maintains internal autonomy and self-governance, but agrees to honor existing trade agreements and allows Federation mediation for external disputes. In exchange, the Federation provides military protection against outside threats and preferential trading status. The silence from Korvax Prime stretched for several minutes. On the observation deck, alien cadets were furiously consulting their tactical manuals, trying to find precedent for this approach. The Krex delegation was making aggressive gestures that indicated extreme confusion, while the crystalline collective had begun generating harmonic frequencies that suggested system overload. "This is not how military scenarios function," Instructor Velnara whispered to Zektar. "They're conducting diplomacy, not warfare. But is it working?" Zektar replied, equally puzzled. Thompson had moved to the logistics station and was coordinating something with the fleet's supply ships. "As a gesture of good faith," she announced over the open channel, "we're prepared to provide immediate humanitarian assistance. Our scans indicate your agricultural stations could benefit from some recent technological improvements we've developed, and we have medical supplies that might help with the health crisis in your outer colonies." "You know about the health crisis?" The Korvaki response carried new tones, surprise and possibly hope. "Our intelligence services are quite thorough," Miller interjected smoothly, "but we prefer to use information to help solve problems rather than exploit weaknesses. We've prepared care packages for immediate distribution, no strings attached." Park began coordinating with the commercial broadcasting equipment they'd requested. Within minutes, signals were transmitting throughout the Korvaki system. Not military communications, but entertainment programs, music, and cultural content from Earth. "We thought you might enjoy seeing some human entertainment while we talk," Chen explained. "Trade negotiations can be long, and we find that shared cultural experiences help build understanding." The observation deck had gone completely silent. Even the usually vocal Garathi were speechless. What they were witnessing violated every principle of military doctrine taught at the academy. The humans weren't fighting the scenario, they were rewriting it entirely. "There is precedent for this approach," came a hesitant voice from Korvac Prime. "Our historical archives contain references to similar arrangements with the old Terran trading companies. But those negotiations took months to complete." "Well," Rodriguez said cheerfully, "we humans have a saying, time is money. We've prepared some economic projections showing how a cooperative arrangement could benefit both our peoples immediately. We're also offering to establish a permanent cultural exchange program and joint research initiatives." Thompson looked up from her station with a grin. "And the food packages are ready for delivery. We've included some Earth delicacies that we think you'll enjoy: pizza, chocolate, and something called barbecue sauce that's proven universally popular with every species we've encountered." Zektar realized his coffee had gone cold. He'd be 18 minutes into the scenario, something unprecedented began happening on Korvac Prime. The planetary defense systems, which had maintained aggressive targeting locks on every approaching fleet for over a century of simulations, started powering down their weapons arrays. "This is impossible," Senior Instructor Markek muttered, his Nexus biorhythm cycling through patterns that indicated complete cognitive dissonance. The Korvaki defensive protocols are hard-coded into the scenario. They cannot simply choose to negotiate. Commander Zektar was beginning to suspect that his understanding of both warfare and artificial intelligence was more limited than he'd previously believed. Perhaps the scenario's adaptive learning protocols are responding to stimuli we've never tested before. On the command platform below, the human team worked with the casual efficiency of people engaged in routine tasks, rather than attempting to solve the galaxy's most challenging military puzzle. Cadet Park had established what appeared to be 6 separate communication channels with different Korvaki factions, while Chen was conducting simultaneous diplomatic negotiations with both the planetary government and the orbital station commanders. "The miners on Asteroid, Platform 7 are particularly interested in our gravitational extraction techniques," Thompson reported to her teammates. "I'm transmitting the basic specifications now as a goodwill gesture. And the Korvaki Defense Fleet wants to know about our shield modulation systems," Rodriguez added. "Apparently their current technology is causing power fluctuations that affect their life support systems." Miller nodded approvingly while reviewing multiple data streams on his command display. "What about the cultural exchange programs?" "The response has been incredible," Park said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "They're broadcasting our music on 3 separate planetary networks, and there's apparently a debate raging in their academic circles about human philosophical concepts." Something about controlled chaos really resonated with their younger population. On the observation deck, a Zephyrian hive mind delegate raised the question that was troubling everyone present. How are they processing so many simultaneous negotiations? Human neural architecture should not be capable of this level of parallel task management. The answer became apparent as the observers watched more closely. The human team wasn't functioning like other species' command structures, with rigid hierarchies and specialized roles. Instead, they seemed to operate as a fluid network, with each member taking initiative in their areas of expertise, while maintaining constant communication with the others. "It's like watching a hive mind," whispered a crystalline collective representative, but composed of individuals who maintain independent decision-making capability. Chen's voice carried clearly through the chamber as she addressed the Korvaki leadership. "We understand your concerns about maintaining cultural independence. That's why we're proposing a confederation model rather than direct federation membership. You keep your government, your laws, and your customs. We just coordinate on trade disputes and mutual defense." The response from Korvac Prime came faster now, with less delay for consultation. "And you would guarantee our autonomy? The Federation has not always honored such agreements in the past." "The Federation can only speak for the Federation," Miller interjected smoothly. "But humans can speak for humans. We'll personally guarantee the terms of any agreement we reach here today. If the Federation violates the compact, Earth will intervene on your behalf." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the observation deck. What Miller was proposing wasn't just diplomatic innovation, it was potential rebellion against Federation authority. The humans were offering to act as independent guarantors of an agreement between the Federation and a rebellious world. Instructor Velnara leaned toward Zektar with obvious concern. "Commander, should we intervene? This appears to be moving beyond the scope of the original scenario." "Let it continue," Zektar replied, though his own confusion was mounting. "I want to see where this leads." Thompson had begun coordinating supply drops to various orbital stations, but instead of military material, she was delivering agricultural supplements, medical supplies, and what appeared to be recreational items. "The station commanders are reporting significant morale improvements," she announced. "Apparently they've been dealing with supply shortages for months." "That's because the scenario includes resource constraints as part of the siege dynamic," Rodriguez explained to his teammates. "But if we're supplying them instead of blockading them, the constraints disappear." Park looked up from his communication station with obvious delight. "You're going to love this. The Korvaki Defense Fleet wants to know if we'd be interested in joint training exercises. They're impressed by our fleet coordination and want to learn our tactical approaches. Joint exercises with the people we're supposed to be conquering?" Chen laughed. "I like it. Set it up." What followed was perhaps the most surreal military demonstration in galactic history. The human fleet, which should have been engaged in orbital bombardment, instead began conducting cooperative maneuvers with the Korvaki defense forces. The planet's defensive platforms, rather than firing on the invading fleet, started coordinating their targeting systems to provide training scenarios for both forces. "This is not warfare," the Krex delegation leader announced loudly. "This is recreational activity." "Is it working?" Miller's voice carried up to the observation deck in response. "Because that's really the only metric that matters." And it was working. In less than 20 minutes, the humans had accomplished what no military force had managed in over a century of attempts. The Korvaki weren't surrendering. They were actively cooperating. The siege was over because there was no longer anyone to siege. "Status report," Chen called out to her team. "Diplomatic negotiations proceeding smoothly," Park replied. "We've got preliminary agreements from 12 separate Korvaki factions, and the holdouts are asking for clarification on trade terms rather than refusing to negotiate. Defense systems are standing down across the system," Rodriguez reported. "The Korvaki Fleet Command wants to formalize cooperative security arrangements. Economic integration is ahead of schedule," Thompson added. "They're requesting immediate implementation of the technology sharing programs, and their manufacturing guilds want to discuss joint ventures." Miller studied the overall tactical display, where the traditional siege map had been replaced by something that looked more like a business conference organizational chart. "Time to resolution?" Chen consulted her diplomatic protocols. "At current pace, we should have a formal confederation agreement signed within the next 2 minutes. 2 minutes? The question came from somewhere in the observation deck, though it was impossible to identify the speaker among the dozens of stunned alien cadets. "We're efficient," Chen replied with a shrug. The final moments of the scenario played out with stunning simplicity. The Korvaki Parliament voted to accept Confederation status within the Federation, while maintaining autonomous governance. The Defense Fleet formally requested ongoing joint training with human forces. The mining operations signed immediate technology sharing agreements. And the entire population voted to establish permanent cultural exchange programs. When the scenario officially ended 19 minutes and 37 seconds after it had begun, the simulation chamber fell completely silent. Commander Zektar stared at the final statistics display in disbelief. 0 casualties on either side. 0 ships destroyed. 0 infrastructure damaged. Complete political resolution achieved. Economic cooperation established. Military alliance formalized. How? Senior Instructor Velnara asked quietly. Miller turned to address the observation deck directly. We didn't fight the scenario. We changed it. Instead of treating the Korvaki as enemies to be defeated, we treated them as potential allies with legitimate concerns. Instead of solving a military problem, we solved a political problem that happened to have military components. But the scenario parameters were fixed, protested Instructor Markek. The Korvaki resistance was programmed to be absolute. No, Chen corrected gently. The Korvaki resistance was programmed to respond to military threats. We didn't present a military threat. We presented an opportunity for mutual benefit. The scenario adapted accordingly, because we gave it something to adapt to that no one had ever tried before. Thompson grinned at the assembled alien cadets. You were all trying to win a war. We decided to prevent a war instead. Turns out prevention is a lot faster than victory. In the stunned silence that followed, Zektar realized he was witnessing something far more significant than a successful military exercise. These humans had just demonstrated a completely new approach to conflict resolution, one that rendered traditional military doctrine almost irrelevant, and they had done it in less than 20 minutes. 18 minutes into the scenario, something unprecedented began happening on Korvac Prime. The planetary defense systems, which had maintained aggressive targeting locks on every approaching fleet for over a century of simulations, started powering down their weapons arrays. This is impossible, Senior Instructor Markek muttered, his Nexus biorhythm cycling through patterns that indicated complete cognitive dissonance. The Korvaki defensive protocols are hard-coded into the scenario. They cannot simply choose to negotiate. Commander Zektar was beginning to suspect that his understanding of both warfare and artificial intelligence was more limited than he'd previously believed. Perhaps the scenario's adaptive learning protocols are responding to stimuli we've never tested before. On the command platform below, the human team worked with the casual efficiency of people engaged in routine tasks, rather than attempting to solve the galaxy's most challenging military puzzle. Cadet Park had established what appeared to be 6 separate communication channels with different Korvaki factions, while Chen was conducting simultaneous diplomatic negotiations with both the planetary government and the orbital station commanders. The miners on Asteroid, Platform 7 are particularly interested in our gravitational extraction techniques, Thompson reported to her teammates. I'm transmitting the basic specifications now as a goodwill gesture. And the Korvaki Defense Fleet wants to know about our shield modulation systems, Rodriguez added. Apparently their current technology is causing power fluctuations that affect their life support systems. Miller nodded approvingly while reviewing multiple data streams on his command display. What about the cultural exchange programs? The response has been incredible, Park said, barely containing his enthusiasm. They're broadcasting our music on 3 separate planetary networks, and there's apparently a debate raging in their academic circles about human philosophical concepts. Something about controlled chaos really resonated with their younger population. On the observation deck, a Zephyrian hive mind delegate raised the question that was troubling everyone present. How are they processing so many simultaneous negotiations? Human neural architecture should not be capable of this level of parallel task management. The answer became apparent as the observers watched more closely. The human team wasn't functioning like other species' command structures, with rigid hierarchies and specialized roles. Instead, they seemed to operate as a fluid network, with each member taking initiative in their areas of expertise, while maintaining constant communication with the others. It's like watching a hive mind, whispered a crystalline collective representative, but composed of individuals who maintain independent decision-making capability. Chen's voice carried clearly through the chamber as she addressed the Korvaki leadership. We understand your concerns about maintaining cultural independence. That's why we're proposing a confederation model rather than direct federation membership. You keep your government, your laws, and your customs. We just coordinate on trade disputes and mutual defense. The response from Korvac Prime came faster now, with less delay for consultation. And you would guarantee our autonomy? The Federation has not always honored such agreements in the past. The Federation can only speak for the Federation, Miller interjected smoothly. But humans can speak for humans. We'll personally guarantee the terms of any agreement we reach here today. If the Federation violates the compact, Earth will intervene on your behalf. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the observation deck. What Miller was proposing wasn't just diplomatic innovation, it was potential rebellion against Federation authority. The humans were offering to act as independent guarantors of an agreement between the Federation and a rebellious world. Instructor Velnara leaned toward Zektar with obvious concern. Commander, should we intervene? This appears to be moving beyond the scope of the original scenario. Let it continue, Zektar replied, though his own confusion was mounting. I want to see where this leads. Thompson had begun coordinating supply drops to various orbital stations, but instead of military material, she was delivering agricultural supplements, medical supplies, and what appeared to be recreational items. The station commanders are reporting significant morale improvements, she announced. Apparently, they've been dealing with supply shortages for months. That's because the scenario includes resource constraints as part of the siege dynamic, Rodriguez explained to his teammates. But if we're supplying them instead of blockading them, the constraints disappear. Park looked up from his communication station with obvious delight. You're going to love this. The Korvaki Defense Fleet wants to know if we'd be interested in joint training exercises. They're impressed by our fleet coordination and want to learn our tactical approaches. Joint exercises with the people we're supposed to be conquering? Chen laughed. I like it. Set it up. What followed was perhaps the most surreal military demonstration in galactic history. The human fleet, which should have been engaged in orbital bombardment, instead began conducting cooperative maneuvers with the Korvaki Defense Forces. The planet's defensive platforms, rather than firing on the invading fleet, started coordinating their targeting systems to provide training scenarios for both forces. This is not warfare, the Krex delegation leader announced loudly. This is recreational activity. Is it working? Miller's voice carried up to the observation deck in response. Because that's really the only metric that matters. And it was working. In less than 20 minutes, the humans had accomplished what no military force had managed in over a century of attempts. The Korvaki weren't surrendering. They were actively cooperating. The siege was over because there was no longer anyone to siege. Status report, Chen called out to her team. Diplomatic negotiations proceeding smoothly, Park replied. We've got preliminary agreements from 12 separate Korvaki factions, and the holdouts are asking for clarification on trade terms rather than refusing to negotiate. Defense systems are standing down across the system, Rodriguez reported. The Korvaki Fleet Command wants to formalize cooperative security arrangements. Economic integration is ahead of schedule, Thompson added. They're requesting immediate implementation of the technology sharing programs, and their manufacturing guilds want to discuss joint ventures. Miller studied the overall tactical display, where the traditional siege map had been replaced by something that looked more like a business conference organizational chart. Time to resolution? Chen consulted her diplomatic protocols. At current pace, we should have a formal confederation agreement signed within the next 2 minutes. 2 minutes? The question came from somewhere in the observation deck, though it was impossible to identify the speaker among the dozens of stunned alien cadets. We're efficient, Chen replied with a shrug. The final moments of the scenario played out with stunning simplicity. The Korvaki Parliament voted to accept Confederation status within the Federation while maintaining autonomous governance. The Defense Fleet formally requested ongoing joint training with human forces. The mining operations signed immediate technology sharing agreements. And the entire population voted to establish permanent cultural exchange programs. When the scenario officially ended 19 minutes and 37 seconds after it had begun, The simulation chamber fell completely silent. Commander Zektar stared at the final statistics display in disbelief. 0 casualties on either side. 0 ships destroyed. 0 infrastructure damaged. Complete political resolution achieved. Economic cooperation established. Military alliance formalized. How? Senior Instructor Velnara asked quietly. Miller turned to address the observation deck directly. We didn't fight the scenario. We changed it. Instead of treating the Korvaki as enemies to be defeated, we treated them as potential allies with legitimate concerns. Instead of solving a military problem, we solved a political problem that happened to have military components. But the scenario parameters were fixed, protested Instructor Markek. The Korvaki resistance was programmed to be absolute. No, Chen corrected gently. The Korvaki resistance was programmed to respond to military threats. We didn't present a military threat. We presented an opportunity for mutual benefit. The scenario adapted accordingly, because we gave it something to adapt to that no one had ever tried before. Thompson grinned at the assembled alien cadets. You were all trying to win a war. We decided to prevent a war instead. Turns out prevention is a lot faster than victory. In the stunned silence that followed, Zektar realized he was witnessing something far more significant than a successful military exercise. These humans had just demonstrated a completely new approach to conflict resolution, one that rendered traditional military doctrine almost irrelevant, and they had done it in less than 20 minutes. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in an academy where quick thinking was valued above all else. Then, as if a dam had burst, the observation deck erupted in a cacophony of voices, sounds, and biorhythmic patterns as dozens of species attempted to process what they had just witnessed. Impossible, rumbled Kethvar, his forearms gesturing in patterns that indicated severe cognitive strain. Military scenarios cannot be resolved through economic cooperation. There must be conflict. There must be victory and defeat. But there was victory, pointed out Cadet Chen from the command platform, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. Everyone got what they wanted. The Korvaki maintained their independence. The Federation secured their trade routes and nobody died. That seems like optimal victory conditions to me. Senior Instructor Velnara descended from the observation deck, her biorhythms cycling through patterns that suggested she was rapidly recalculating fundamental assumptions about military doctrine. Cadet Miller, I need to understand your strategic framework. What military academy taught you these techniques? Miller exchanged glances with his teammates before answering. No military academy, ma'am. This is just how humans approach problems. We look for solutions that benefit everyone involved instead of solutions that require someone to lose. But conflict resolution requires structure, protocol, established procedures, protested a Nexus delegate whose translator was struggling to keep up with his rapid-fire objections. You cannot simply improvise solutions to complex strategic scenarios. Why not? Asked Rodriguez, genuinely curious. If improvisation produces better results than established procedures, isn't improvisation the superior approach? The question sent ripples of disturbed discussion through the assembled aliens. For species that had refined military doctrine over millennia, the suggestion that improvisation could outperform careful planning was fundamentally disturbing. Commander Zektar made his way down to the command platform, studying the final scenario statistics that defied every expectation he'd developed over decades of military service. Cadet Miller, I must ask, was this performance representative of human military capability, or were you specifically selected for unusual tactical abilities? Representative, sir, Miller replied. Actually, this team was chosen more or less at random from our graduating class. Any of our classmates could have achieved similar results, though they might have approached it differently. Differently how? Thompson grinned. Well, Cadet Jackson's team would probably have organized a cultural festival instead of a trade negotiation. And Martinez's group would likely have started with food diplomacy. They're convinced that sharing meals can resolve any conflict. Food diplomacy? The concept seemed to break something in Senior Instructor Markek's cognitive processes. Humans bond over shared meals, Park explained helpfully. It's a basic social protocol for us. Hard to stay enemies with someone when you're enjoying their cooking. As if summoned by the mention of food, several human team members began unpacking supplies from their personal gear. the kitchen facilities that had so puzzled the Academy staff. Within minutes, they had established what appeared to be an impromptu dining area on the command platform. "Would anyone like to try some human cuisine?" Chen offered, addressing the growing crowd of alien instructors and cadets. "We brought ingredients for pizza, which has proven universally popular in our preliminary cultural exchange programs." The offer was met with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for diplomatic incidents. The humans had just revolutionized military doctrine, and now they were offering to cook lunch. "This is a military academy," Instructor Velnara pointed out weakly. "Not a social gathering. Why can't it be both?" Thompson asked while assembling what appeared to be food preparation equipment. "Learning is more effective in comfortable social environments. Stress inhibits cognitive function." Within the hour, something unprecedented in the Academy's history was taking place. The simulation chamber had been transformed into an impromptu cultural exchange center, with human cadets preparing and serving food to increasingly fascinated alien visitors. The pizza was indeed proving universally popular, though some species required significant modifications to accommodate their dietary requirements. "The flavor combinations are mathematically impossible," declared a crystalline collective, representative while carefully analyzing a slice that had been adapted for silicon-based life forms, yet the result is aesthetically pleasing. "How do humans calculate such complex biochemical interactions?" "We don't calculate," Rodriguez explained while manning what appeared to be a primitive cooking apparatus. "We experiment, try different combinations until we find something that tastes good, but that's terribly inefficient." "Maybe," Rodriguez acknowledged, "but it's also how we discovered chocolate, coffee, and barbecue sauce. Some of our best discoveries came from accidents and experiments that weren't supposed to work." The informal gathering continued as Academy staff tried to process the implications of what had occurred. Director Naltos, the Academy's senior administrator, arrived to find her most prestigious training facility transformed into what could only be described as a party. "Commander Zektar," she began in tones that suggested official displeasure, "I was informed that Team Omega had completed the Korvax scenario in under 20 minutes. I assumed there had been a system malfunction." "No malfunction, Director," Zektar replied, though his own confusion was still evident. "The scenario functioned exactly as designed. The humans simply approached it from a direction no one had considered before." Director Naltos reviewed the scenario statistics on her portable display, her biorhythms shifting through several cycles of disbelief. "These results indicate complete mission success with zero strategic resource expenditure and negative casualty rates." "How is it possible to have negative casualties?" "The medical supplies we provided apparently cured a disease outbreak on one of the orbital stations," Thompson explained while serving what appeared to be a dessert item to a fascinated Garathi cadet. "So technically we saved more lives than we threatened." "This is not how military scenarios function," Director Naltos stated firmly. "With respect, Director," Miller said, approaching with what appeared to be a steaming beverage. "Maybe that's the problem. Military scenarios are designed to test military solutions, but not all problems require military solutions, even when they appear to be military problems." Chen joined the conversation, carrying a plate of food items that seemed to be generating positive responses from multiple species. "We've been studying your Academy's historical records. Every conflict you've trained for, every scenario you've developed, assumes that victory requires someone to be defeated. But human experience suggests that the best victories are the ones where everybody wins. But resource competition, territorial disputes, ideological conflicts," Director Naltos protested. "These cannot all be resolved through cooperation." "Why not?" Park asked. "If the underlying needs driving the conflict can be addressed through cooperation, the conflict itself becomes unnecessary." "Because," interrupted Kethvar, who had been observing the food preparation with obvious fascination, "cooperation requires trust, and trust requires predictability. Your species appears to thrive on unpredictability." "Controlled unpredictability," Rodriguez corrected. "We're not random. We're adaptive." "There's a difference." The Garathi warrior studied the human cadet for a long moment. "Explain this difference." "Random means anything could happen," Thompson said, pausing in her food preparation. "Adaptive means we change our approach based on what the situation requires. We're unpredictable to our opponents because we don't follow fixed patterns. But we're predictable to our allies because our goals remain consistent. And your goal is always cooperation? Asked a Zephyrian delegate whose hive mind was processing the conversation through dozens of parallel thought streams. Our goal is finding solutions that work, Miller replied. Cooperation usually works better than conflict, so that's what we prefer. But we're not pacifist. If someone insists on conflict despite our attempts at cooperation, we're very good at conflict too. Very good how? Director Naltos inquired. Chen smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and slightly predatory. Let's just say that when we apply the same adaptive, unpredictable approach to warfare that we applied to diplomacy today, our enemies tend to surrender very quickly. As the afternoon progressed and more Academy staff arrived to witness the unprecedented scene, word began spreading throughout the galactic communication networks. The story was almost too strange to believe. An unknown species had solved the galaxy's most challenging military scenario, not through superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but by refusing to acknowledge that it was a military scenario at all. And they had celebrated by teaching their former instructors how to make pizza. By evening, the first queries were arriving from military academies on dozens of worlds, all asking the same question. Could these humans visit their facilities to demonstrate their techniques? The galaxy's understanding of warfare was about to change forever, one meal at a time. 6 months after the 20-minute revolution, the Galactic Military Academy bore little resemblance to the institution that had trained officers according to centuries-old protocols. The corridors that once echoed with the formal cadence of traditional military drilling now buzzed with the energetic discussions of integrated learning teams. Commander Zektar, now Director Zektar, following his promotion in recognition of his role in documenting the paradigm shift, walked through the Academy's transformed central hub. Where once stood rigid species-segregated training areas, collaborative workspaces now hosted mixed teams of cadets from dozens of worlds, all working together on problems that would have been considered impossible to solve just months earlier. The changes had begun gradually. Human exchange students arrived at the Academy in groups of 12, following the team structure that had proven so effective. But rather than simply attending classes, they had begun teaching them. Within weeks, human methodology seminars had become the most requested courses in Academy history. The key insight, explained Professor Chen, formerly Cadet Chen, now the Academy's first professor of adaptive strategic studies, to a mixed species advanced tactics class, is that most strategic challenges are actually complex systems with multiple solution paths. Traditional approaches focus on identifying the optimal path and executing it perfectly. Human approaches focus on identifying multiple viable paths and switching between them as circumstances change. Her current class represented a revolution in military education. Garathi warriors sat alongside crystalline collective analysts. Zephyrian hive-mind coordinators collaborated with independent-minded Altarians. And everyone seemed to be learning faster than Academy records had ever documented. Professor Chen raised Cadet Velkoth, a young Krex whose aggressive instincts had been carefully channeled into competitive problem-solving. How do we determine which solution path to pursue when multiple options appear equally viable? Try them all, Chen replied with the casual confidence that had become characteristic of human instructors. Not simultaneously necessarily, but in rapid sequence. Humans call it rapid prototyping. Test ideas quickly and cheaply. Keep what works, discard what doesn't. The concept had taken months for other species to fully grasp. The notion of deliberately choosing potentially inferior solutions for the sake of learning and adaptation challenged fundamental assumptions about efficiency and resource management. In another wing of the Academy, the former Korvac simulation chamber had been converted into what was now called the Impossible Problems Laboratory. Teams from across the galaxy worked on scenarios that had previously been considered unsolvable, applying increasingly sophisticated versions of the adaptive methodology that humans had demonstrated. Today's challenge involved the siege of Rathani Station, a scenario based on a real conflict that had lasted 3 years and resulted in the destruction of an entire star system. Historical records indicated that no peaceful resolution had been possible due to irreconcilable ideological differences between the competing factions. Team designation, Synthesis, a mixed species group led by former human cadet Miller, now senior instructor Miller, was 20 minutes into their attempt when they achieved something that made Academy historians recalculate their understanding of strategic possibilities. Status report. Miller called out to his diverse team. The Rathani loyalists have agreed to participate in joint cultural exchange programs, reported Sub-Commander Kethvar, the former Garathi skeptic who had become one of Miller's most effective students. Their initial hostility was based on incomplete information about rebel intentions. The rebel coalition is requesting mediation for their territorial disputes, added Coordinator Zilnara, a Zephyrian whose hive mind provided unparalleled communication capabilities. They were unaware that the Loyalists' resource extraction was defensive rather than expansionist in nature. Economic analysis indicates that both factions have complementary resource needs and production capabilities, announced analyst Checkmore, a crystalline collective member whose mathematical modeling had been enhanced by human concepts of good enough solutions. Cooperation would benefit both groups significantly. Miller reviewed the tactical display where, once again, a military scenario was transforming into something entirely different. Time to resolution? Preliminary agreements in place, reported communications specialist Yeltar, an Altarian who had learned to appreciate the harmonic beauty of chaos. Formal peace accords should be finalized within minutes. The scenario ended 17 minutes and 43 seconds after it began, with both factions not only at peace but actively planning joint ventures. The Academy's most devastating historical conflict had been resolved through what was becoming recognized as standard human-influenced methodology. But the changes extended far beyond the Academy. Across the galaxy, conflicts that had simmered for decades were being resolved through applications of adaptive cooperation principles. Trade disputes were settled through creative resource sharing. Territorial conflicts were resolved through innovative colonization partnerships. Even ideological differences were being bridged through cultural exchange programs that emphasized understanding rather than conversion. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some species found human methodology difficult to master, preferring the predictability of traditional approaches. A few civilizations actively resisted the changes, viewing cooperative problem-solving as a threat to their warrior cultures or hierarchical societies. But the results spoke for themselves. Galactic conflict rates had dropped to their lowest levels in recorded history. Economic cooperation was at an all-time high. Scientific advancement was accelerating as species shared knowledge rather than hoarding it. Even art and culture were flourishing as different civilizations discovered the creative potential of collaborative expression. In the Academy's newest edition, the Interspecies Cultural Center, which had grown from the impromptu food sharing that followed the original Korvac scenario, representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered daily to share meals, stories, and ideas. The center had become the unofficial heart of the Academy, where formal military training blended seamlessly with the kind of relationship building that humans insisted was essential to lasting peace. Director Zektar found Miller there one evening, teaching a group of senior officers from various species how to prepare what had become known as diplomatic cuisine, food designed to appeal to multiple species' dietary requirements while facilitating productive conversation. Senior Instructor Miller, Zektar said, accepting a plate of the carefully balanced meal that had become standard for interspecies negotiations. I've received preliminary reports from the Galaxy Council regarding implementation of adaptive methodology in actual conflicts. The success rate is approaching 93%. Miller nodded while adjusting seasoning levels for a Nexus delegate whose biochemistry required precise alkaline balance. That sounds about right. Most conflicts are really just communication problems complicated by fear and resource scarcity. Address the underlying concerns and the conflict usually resolves itself. But what about the 7% that don't respond to cooperative approaches? Zektar asked. We're still working on those, Miller admitted. But 7% is a lot better than the 30 to 40% of conflicts that used to escalate into major wars under the old system. Chen approached from across the center, where she had been facilitating a discussion between historical enemies, who were now working together on joint research projects. The important thing is that we've shifted the default assumption. Instead of assuming that conflict is inevitable and preparing for war, we now assume that cooperation is possible and prepare for peace. And when cooperation isn't possible, Zektar pressed. Then we fight, Miller replied matter-of-factly. But we fight smarter, faster, and with clear objectives for returning to peaceful cooperation as soon as possible. The goal is never victory for its own sake. It's sustainable peace. As the evening progressed and the cultural center filled with the sounds of dozens of species sharing meals and ideas, Zektar reflected on the transformation that had begun with 12 human cadets solving an impossible problem in 20 minutes. The humans hadn't just taught the galaxy new military tactics. They had taught the galaxy to see conflict itself differently, not as an inevitable clash of incompatible interests, but as a complex problem that usually had solutions benefiting everyone involved. The Academy's motto, unchanged for over 2 millennia, read victory through superior force. Proposals were already being discussed to update it to something more appropriate for the new era. Peace through creative solutions. But perhaps the most significant change was visible every evening in the cultural center, where former enemies shared meals and planned collaborative futures. The humans had demonstrated that the strongest military force in the galaxy wasn't superior weapons or brilliant tactics, it was the ability to turn enemies into allies, and as director, Zektar watched representatives from across the galaxy working together with casual familiarity. He realized that the 20-minute revolution hadn't just changed how the galaxy approached military problems. It